today, and they are expected to get their results tomorrow. And this is what we've been talking about this week, a federal quarantine for the Atlanta lawyer diagnosed with the drug-resistant strain of TB. Well, that has technically been lifted. However, Andrew Speaker will remain in isolation at a hospital in Denver. Speaker is the first person to be placed under quarantine, federal quarantine, since 1963. And while the case in Denver is rare, other forms of tuberculosis are pretty common. In fact, one case of TB is reported every week in New York. Houston, Dr. Mitchel Abramsky from the Department of Health and Human Services is here to tell us what we're up against. First, of course, there's a difference between having active tuberculosis and being exposed to it, right?
Right. With tuberculosis, there's basically two forms. One is where you're just infected, which is you have a positive skin test, or now is a blood test, quantiferon, that you'd be positive for that. But you're asymptomatic, you're not contagious, you can't spread to anybody else. And then people that are infected, they have a 10% chance over their lifetime of developing active disease.
Which would be contagious, right?
Right.
Could be.
Right, but you know, basic symptoms that are cough, fever, night sweats, weight loss, and how infectious somebody is depends on how severe the disease is at that time. If they have a cavity in their chests, they're more infectious, and if they're coughing or if they have it in the larynx,
sure,
they can spread it more.
And when it comes to a disease like this, I think people wonder, should I be concerned every time the person next to me is coughing vigorously? I mean, how common is tuberculosis, especially right here in Houston?
In Houston, we have about 300 cases a year, and in the county outside of Houston, about 120 cases last year.
And very contagious, not very contagious. How close do you have to really be to somebody to catch this?
Usually it's not that contagious. You can't catch it like the cold. It usually takes prolonged exposure, on an ongoing basis, usually like at least 8 hours.
Which brings up the point of international travel, even travel here within the U.S., even people catching flights from Houston to Dallas. Should they be worried? And what can people do to protect themselves against possible exposure to something like this? Or should it even be something that they're worried about on something like an airline flight that's maybe only 1 or 2 hours long? On
short flights, there's never been any demonstrated transmission of TB. Most of the studies where they've studied for the longer flights over 8-hour duration, along international flights, and when transmission has occurred, the person was more contagious than this person here.
And let's talk about the drug-resistant strain of tuberculosis that's been in the national headlines with this story. That's very, very rare, correct?
Correct.
And when it comes to something like this, should people be concerned about themselves, or is it something that really, as long as you're keeping up with your own health concerns, kind of staying away from people that are sick, things like that, it's not something you have to worry about catching from somebody who may not even have symptoms, apparently?
Right. Rates of TB in the United States are a lot less than other areas. There's some places where you're more prone to be exposed, like crowded conditions, like in homeless shelters or in prisons. Because most of the tuberculosis, where the resistance is in countries where there's high rates of TB and poor TB control programs.
In terms of TB control, do you feel like this particular case just seemed to get a lot of attention, or do you feel like there are controls in order, I suppose, that pretty much keep this from spreading once you can identify, perhaps somebody who has it?
There are controls in order to prevent somebody from spreading tuberculosis. If they're infectious, we put them usually on home isolation and keep them from spreading until they're on effective treatment and it can be rendered non-contagious.
All right, Dr. Mitchel Abramsky, thank you so much for coming in this morning.
Okay.
Coming